Sure. Good evening and welcome to the 399th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series on comics, animation, illustration, and other text image work. It's funded by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation and the New School. Our guests tonight are Damian Mandzunowski and Lena Henningsen. Damian is a postdoctoral researcher in the European Research Council-funded project Comics Culture in the People's Republic of China, that's called China Comics, at the Center for Asian and Transcultural Studies at Heidelberg University. He was a curator of the largest digital collection of Chinese caricatures from the late 1970s and published on their production patterns and gendered visuals. He is also preparing a monograph based on his dissertation on political study and other collective reading practices in China after 1949. His research focuses on the intersections of politics, visual culture, and everyday life. And Lena is the principal investigator of the same project, Comics Culture in the People's Republic of China, at Heidelberg University. Before that, she was a junior professor at the University of Freiburg, conducting another ERC project on reading practices in China called Read China. With a background in Chinese studies, literary and cultural studies, she is interested in the production, circulation, and reception of texts, both as literary artifacts and as concrete material objects. She has published widely on topics such as unofficial manuscript fiction from the Cultural Revolution and copyright infringements on the 2000s bestseller market. Has published a number of translations of Chinese lianhuanhua. These are these palm-sized picture books that we'll be looking at of sequential drawings, and is now working on a monograph on the adaptation of Lu Xun into this picture book format. So welcome, Damian and Lena.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting us and for having us here. In this presentation today, we want to explore the specifics of heroes and villains in Chinese comics and caricature. And we also want to give you, because we expect that we see a number of our friends here, but there's also people who maybe are not so familiar with comic art from China. So we also want to give you an idea of the specific characteristics of comics and caricature in China. So while there are numerous differences between Chinese and non-Chinese comics and caricature, heroes and villains are a constituent feature of both. For most cases, a hero can only be a hero when there's a villain to fight against. A villain is clearly marked if there is a heroic person fighting him or her. I mean, most of the heroes are male, as you will see. We therefore will approach Chinese comics through the lens of heroes and villains, addressing a number of questions. So first of all, how are heroes and villains defined, and by whom are they defined? How are they designed in terms of their character traits and physical features? How are they marked aesthetically as heroes and villains? And how are they embedded into the larger visual landscape of the country? How are they embedded into the ideological landscape of the country? From this, then, there's another question that is interesting, which is, what is the role of politics in the creation of heroes and villains? And what is their social impact? So what does reading about these heroes and villains in comic art, in caricature, mean to people? How were these heroes and villains popularized, and what were the various popular refractions over time? And we have a few examples that we will show in the second half of the talk. Up front, our temporal focus will be on the Mao era and the early post-Mao era, as that corresponds to the time when Chinese comics, so in particular, the lianhuanhua that are the focus of this talk, were most popular. Also, as you will realize in a moment, this is a very particular brand of comics, which saw its peak popularity throughout much of the 20th century. And we do not talk about comics production from contemporary China or also from the larger Chinese world, because that would simply be too much. I can't do this. Oh, sorry. So, to do this, we will start off with an introduction to Chinese comics and caricature, like the 101 on this. We will then give you a very brief introduction on what we are setting up to do in the China Comics Project and what are the specific resources that we have here at Heidelberg. So we do a bit of advertisement of the resources at hand. And then we will start by defining the role of heroes and villains in Chinese comics of the Mao era and how they are refracted through literature and art. And then we want to welcome you to the Maoverse by addressing a number of heroes and villains, Lei Feng, Lu Xun, Sun Wukong, the Gang of Four, and how they are refracted in Chinese comics. So this will be a slightly eclectic run through some of the most popular heroes and villains from China. And in this, we will focus on their constitutive characteristics and show how these persons or these heroes and villains are interconnected. In fact, looking at Chinese culture through comics, we propose the term of the Maoverse, the Maoist Mao universe, with Mao Zedong being the godlike superhero, the sun-like authority to which all action and attention are directed. In this Maoverse, other heroes always appear in relation to him. They venerate him, they take him as a model, they are reading his books, his works. And more than that, they can only be heroes as proper models of Mao Zedong. So through this, chains of heroes and villains can be mapped out, with the villains in particular rather fragile and changing over time, while the heroes are more stable. And these changes occur with changes in the political climate. And then we will end with a glimpse into the post-Mao years, sketching out the legacies and refractions of this Maoverse. Damian and I have been working on this for some time now, and for the presentation, we came up with a good cop, bad cop distribution of labor. I will present almost exclusively on heroes, and my colleague Damian Mandzunowski on the villains. Correspondingly, I will be talking more about lianhuanhua, and he will be more talking on the caricature element. That is not to say that Damian is the villain, but he has been working for a long time on the villains, so he happily took on the villains. And probably it's more fun to talk about the villains in any ways. Okay. And speaking of the villains, I'm handing over to our villain expert now.
Not expert, but it's basically a time in life when you're attracted to villains, I guess. So yes, thanks as well from my side, Ben, for having us here. And what do we talk about when we talk about Chinese comics? Of course, as we all know, visual textual narratives include many different forms. But as Lena said, we are narrowing down on a temporal moment where really two were dominating. One was lianhuanhua, which are essentially comic books, which Lena will talk in a second, and the other one was what was known as manhua, which essentially could be translated as caricatures or cartoons. There was also, of course, animated film and other forms, but we are looking here today at printed media, non-moving pictures. Now, why do we propose to use the term manhua rather than simply just talk about Chinese caricature? Mainly for the reason that they were part of a larger socialist realm in which caricatures were used as a didactic or educational tool to pinpoint and showcase in clearly understandable manner what was wrong or what was bad or what was to be criticized or what was not to be done in the society of the past, or also in the society of the present. because even though, of course, we are now post-1949 in socialism, there were still issues that needed to be solved. And just to give you this brief introduction to manhua, they were a medium or a form or a genre, if you will, that arose from a local Chinese tradition of cartooning, which could be traced back to the 19th century or even earlier, as well as more prominently inspired directly by ways in which cartooning was being used in the Soviet Union, Crocodile being one of these magazines. And here in the audience is also Maria Guleva, who can talk much more about this than we, who is a specialist on this early phase and also on others, I'm sure. But she has been working a lot on a journal called Manhua, which was being published in the first 10 years of the PRC, out of which we're going to use a lot of examples later on, or some examples later on, to show you what's been happening. The way Lena and I are trying to kind of propose here this connection between manhua and lianhuanhua and villains and heroes is to say that there was a shared language of visuals, a shared visual language across those media which use text and images to convey messages. And caricatures in particular, perhaps, via their way of criticizing and mocking and exaggerating certain traits, were useful for political campaigns, for party struggles, and many other things. Lena.
Okay, the other phenomenon are lianhuanhua. This is what they look like. So they have the same size, roughly. I have a small smartphone, so they are really pocket-sized books. And this is a distinct genre within the medium of comics, but it has been changing over time and is also related to a number of other phenomena, or has been termed with a number of other things. So it is distinct from manhua, manga, or manhua, the manga that you are familiar with. And there's at least two terms that have been also used for this, which are quite elucidative because they tell us something about the history of this genre. So one term that has been used is called haumashu, which is literally translatable as horse race books. This points to the transmedial relationship within which lianhuanhua arose in the early 20th century. At the time, cinema was the medium. So you wanted to watch all the movies, but still movie houses were rare and cinema tickets were pricey. So the publishing houses set out to publish pocket-sized versions of the latest movies, and whoever would be the first to churn out their respective pocketbook would win this literal or this metaphorical horse race and be able to benefit most from such a movie. This is a phenomenon that Nick Stember has also referred to as paper cinema, and Nick is also in the audience, so you can also ask him questions about that later. Another term that has been used for to describe this phenomenon is also called xiaorenshu, books for young people. That is something that points to the intended or the actual audience of these books, namely young children and also people who were not fully literate had access to these books or could, through these books, participate in a reading culture of the country. A related term is lianhuanhua that was established in the early discourses of this medium and is a bit linked to woodcut art, both to traditional Chinese as well as to modern European woodcut art, which came to China through people like the Luxun that we will be meeting again later on. And then, of course, we have the term lianhuanhua, which literally can be translated as sequential images. So we are right at sequential art, one of the terms that you will be familiar with from Western discourses. What you need to know, I think, is that this really is a phenomenon of the 20th century, and we see three large waves that also coincide with a number of other waves. The first wave of popularity arose in the 1920s and 30s, and that was very much linked to cinema culture. Then we see the second wave in the 1950s and 60s, the early years of the People's Republic of China, where lianhuanhua were purposely used as educational tools. So they were really handy to teach people all sorts of things, ranging from knowledge about hygiene, knowledge about the country's constitution, knowledge about the good use of pesticides. So that would come clad in a entertaining story with nice pictures. And of course, it's also a good way to teach people about ideology. Then we have the Cultural Revolution, which saw a general hiatus in whatever publication you had. And then in the 1970s, so in the waning years of the Cultural Revolution, we see the next wave, and that at first is a wave that promotes hardcore ideology. And then with the end of the Cultural Revolution, we see a veritable explosion of topics, of visual styles, etc. So we have these three waves. And before I go into the contents, I want to start with the practices of how these books were read. So I have shown you already that most of them had this size, rather low quality paper. You see that many of these books were being read at bookstalls. So these are traveling or not traveling small private libraries where people would go and spend a few cents to borrow, maybe to take home, but very often only borrow it to read at the street side, to read a respective comic. And I mean, you could even read it for free if you just stand behind somebody and would read over their shoulder. What you also see on these images is that this is very much a leisurely experience. It is a private experience. People are, yet it is public, but it is an experience that for most of the part is not straight within the realm of politics or ideology, at least not in all of these reading settings. So it's not guided collective reading. You can also see that there's a number of different distribution formats for these lianhuanhua. What we look at here is mostly these small booklets. I have a number of them, so they can become a bit bigger. And they can also come as specified journals, for example, the ones that you see here to the back. So that would be monthly issues containing several lianhuanhua stories. Now, if we open our lianhuanhua, we can see a vast amount of stylistic differences. These are all biographies of Lu Xun, and you see that some are, this one is film stills. You would also have, this one is a stage still. You have black and white drawings of different styles. You have oil paintings, and up here it's a bit cut off. You even have woodcut art. And that, of course, all gives these lianhuanhua a distinct texture. But I would say mainstream lianhuanhua is either these drawings or it's produced from film stills when it's adaptations of films. So a quick, I said we do a bit of self-advertisement. The China Comics Project is 5 people and 5 projects. I'm looking at adaptations of literary texts into comics. Damian is looking at the political dimensions of comics. Astrid Xiao is working on aesthetics and theories of lianhuanhua. Then we have Ju Sung on the project, and she's working on comics and fandom culture. And then our 5th project is a computational research project where we will be mapping, IDEA will be mapping visual traces throughout a large corpora. We will also be, or we are also doing translations of lianhuanhua into English and other languages, building a database. And well, to show you this, This is not the database that we built, but this is a glance into the library catalog of our university. Our university has 3,000 lianhuanhua stored downstairs in the third downstairs floor. And they are also digitized. So if there's somebody in the audience who is interested in researching that, you can get in contact with our librarians or with me, and then we will put you in contact, because this is just a very great resource, both material-wise and if it's just digitized. This is a glance at one of the translations that we have on our webpage. And you see these high-end scans that we took from the Heidelberg library collections, and you get a transcription of the text, and you get the translations that we did. Most of these are, well, actually, so far, all of these are student projects. So I did this in classes, or colleagues did that in classes with students, but the translations are very close to the original, and we also provide readers with critical introductions so you can make sense of what these comics are. And this collection will be expanded as we are going over time. Okay, that's the end of our self-advertisement. Let's go into our discussion of heroes and villains in Chinese comics and how they are refactored through literature and art. The background to this is the setup of socialist realism and a very strong belief in the educative power of literature and art in China. That is not something new when the communists came, but this has been a strong belief for decades and centuries. And in the modernization efforts that set off in the late 19th century and early 20th century, this really grew stronger with the belief that if you reform the language and the literature of the country, you can actually transform China into a modern country. And the communists, again, built on this and clearly saw that, okay, if we want a new socialist man or socialist woman, literature and art are of crucial importance to that. So socialist realism became a sort of state rational, and it became written down in 1942 with Mao Zedong's so-called Yan'an talks as the foundation. And in this, he basically says authors and artists should study from the people, and they should create art that is for the people. But of course, it is always an art that promotes the goals of the CCP, of politics, and it's always the aim to create a better future along the lines, along the path given by the Communist Party. In the Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76, this then becomes even more prominent through the three prominences, Santuchu, which are defined. Each story or each image is to have a hero, and this hero stands out in descending order from three levels. So we have the hero, and on the top and below him you have the good characters. Below that there's the people, and the people of course is also good. And then below, at the bottom rung of the hierarchy, we have the villains. And you may see this is, okay, it's an easy storytelling device, but it has to do with the fact that the heroes are supposed to be the models to emulate, to strive to be like, who everybody should strive to be like. And then the villains is, of course, the scum that nobody should be like. And you would go looking for your villains if you need to find them in your village or something like that. Heroes turn into revolutionary role models, and among them we have fictional ones that are invented, and then we have, of course, real, actual heroes that were existent, ranging from Lei Feng to Mao Zedong, who is, of course, the superhero, or the American, I think Canadian doctor Norman Bethune, who has been celebrated in propaganda, in the texts of Mao Zedong, and also, of course, in comic art.
Yeah, I'm gonna take over and continue by going a step back. When we were starting, or we knew we were gonna start this project, Lena and I, it was towards the end of last year. We went to Heidelberg, we went to the library, we asked our librarian friend and project cooperator Hannah to show us the collection they have. And as Lena said, it's over 3,000 original historical lianhuanhua items, printed comics, which, just to give you an overview, because all of this as we're talking here is about the Chinese comics. So you might ask yourself, well, what's the difference, or what's the similarity to, let's say, American comics or European comics? And I think that we tend, especially nowadays, to look a lot at the differences between China and us, or the West, or whatever. And I don't agree fully. I think lianhuanhua are a perfect example of many similarities. When we got those boxes of the collection in Heidelberg, and we saw, Lena and I, the 3,000 comics lying there, it was quite overwhelming, as you can imagine, but also quite inspiring. And many ideas started to pop into our heads. As you know, if you just go to a bookstore, to a library, and just start browsing stuff, that's what we did. We just sat there for a whole day, just browsing, and not really reading, or not reading, just looking at the comics. And one of the things which stood out is, as I said, how similar those media are, that you have things that are supposed to be read and reread and shared, but they're also supposed to be falling apart, right? Just like comics used to be. And that's why the ones which did not fall apart are so valuable. And many other things, the educational value, or the question of the educational value. Is it good to read comics or not? And all those things. This was one idea that we had. Another idea that we kind of had back then, but subconsciously, and which very consciously came back to us 3 weeks ago in preparation for this talk, is that when you look at the vastness of those comics, there is a shared visual language, which we now kind of propose to call the Maoverse, half jokingly, half seriously. Because, well, what is a shared universe? You know, this trendy topic, this trendy theme nowadays, right? What is the MCU or the DCU or whatever you want? Everything has now a universe where it is essentially a fictional realm in which certain characters can interact with each other, even if they maybe not obviously would interact with each other, where there are some kind of rules and set of guidelines or ideas which bound this whole universe, and then certain villains, if you will, or events that maybe spring and destroy and break up this universe. And this is a very work in progress kind of thing that we have here, but we do think that it's possible to look at the 20, 30, maybe 40 years of Chinese comics that we're looking at through this point of view of a shared comics universe. Because we have those real and fictional heroes who come up here and there, and we have role models which then are shared. So maybe the face has changed, right? Maybe, like with Captain America or with Spider-Man, you have different people inheriting the shield or the suit, but what the suit and the shield stand for are quite similar. It's the same or very similar in those things. And then you have fictional villains who are larger than life, and also real life villains who come in, like Captain America is punching Hitler or Donald Trump in more recent iterations. It's the same in our lianhuanhua, that we have the bad spies or capitalists or other, which we're going to look at. So this is kind of one thing. Another thing is, of course, the shared values, symbols, metaphors, aesthetics. And just to give you an example, we're going to now move in to show you the examples. And the first one is from something which is called a model piece, which were particularly well designed and overthought operas, ballets, and theater pieces from the Cultural Revolution. Lena, if you want to show the next slide, please. This is the taking of a Tiger Mountain by strategy. And as you see here on the first image that we see for now, this is a screen grab from a recorded version of the Beijing Opera, of the revolutionary Beijing Opera. And here, I think you can quite clearly see this three prominences principle that Lena talked about, and that is well established and well researched. We have the good revolutionary army of heroes, but among them you see the one central hero with his hand raised, kind of standing out. And in the comic adaptation, essentially this scene has been transmedially readapted and put on paper almost one-to-one. And the same with the villains. So it needs to be clear who is good and who is bad in those storylines. If you go to the next slide, we see again a screen grab from the film version where the main hero, if you will, is strongly pointing against the villains, who, as you see, it's all very clear, I think, also for people unfamiliar with this visual code. Darkness, light, the faces, the attire, who is good, who is bad. And in the comic version, it is again very, very similar. Why is it so similar? Well, very often because they really literally traced the images onto paper and make it look like this. And this example, of course, is a little bit simplified, but what we wanted to show you here is that what's happening is that the way this is depicted will then be repeated, and we can find it in many different places. For example, in the character of a real life soldier who later became a fictional hero of Lei Feng.
And maybe adding to this, you can also see that, so the hero literally stands up, so he's much bigger, much taller, and is depicted like that. And the lianhuanhua, of course, is even more suitable to emphasize that, because that villain is not only in a crouching position, but he's actually drawn, the face is much smaller in comparison, literally belittling that person. So I think that's a quite telling example. But we want to move on to Lei Feng. Lei Feng is a rather special character. He was a positive role model already during his lifetime, a model soldier, even though he never fought a single battle in his life. He did a lot of good deeds, which then were widely publicized and restaged photographically. So there's a lot of photographic evidence from his life, but it was always taken after the event. And what happened then is that in 1962, he was ran over by a lamp pole, basically, and he died. And after his death, his fame increased by gazillions for a number of reasons. There was a diary that then was published. It's pretty sure, we can be pretty sure that this diary was then also heavily edited prior to publication. And a major study from Lei Feng campaign set out through the entire country, endorsed through the calligraphy of Mao Zedong. So you see how Mao Zedong reinforces the studying of Lei Feng. But if you read the diary, in the diary, Lei Feng constantly reads and studies Mao Zedong. So the cult around Lei Feng, in fact, is something to add, something to aid the cult around Mao Zedong. What Lei Feng does, I said, he doesn't really fight a battle with, as a soldier, it's rather everyday heroism. He mends other people's socks. He donates money for the good cause. When there's torrential rainfall, he takes his own blanket to cover the cement in order to save the labor efforts of his company. So that is a heroism that is needed for the construction of the country. And in a way, Lei Feng is a rather unlikely hero because there's no obvious villain in these stories. Yeah, we have the good guy. There is, however, what we can say, there's an abstract thread running through all of this, and that thread is, of course, okay, what happened if Mao Zedong and the Communist Party were not there? And we have references back to the villains and the bad life that was there in the time before the communists took over. The life of Lei Feng has been rendered in countless comics, and I think this is not even all sort of all extant covers of the life of Lei Feng, and they work with quotations from the diary. And I will just show you, and they depict stories that are well documented through photographic evidence. Again, they very often follow the depictions of the photographs, and they depict this everyday heroism. What I want to show you here, however, is how they promote, again, these aesthetic values of the Maoverse and the contents of the Maoverse. So this is from a 1963, I think, comic. I can see it here. Rendering the life of Lei Feng, and on in different ways you see Mao Zedong on all of these pictures. So here he's part of the background with a big poster. That's a very likely and very realist scene. And here Mao Zedong, on account of the poster, he rises to utmost prominence. Then we see a meeting here of Lei Feng and Mao Zedong in the second panel. This is, if you look at the panel and have read your diary of Lei Feng, you know they never met, but Lei Feng has a dream in which he meets Mao Zedong. And that is, of course, a brilliant rendering of the Maoverse, because you have the fatherly figure towering across, above, literally, Lei Feng, even, cutting the frame of the picture, rendering Mao as a supersized figure. There is historical truth to that, insofar as Lei Feng was a rather small man, and they are both included in this halo that normally only surrounds Mao Zedong. So through Lei Feng gets his share of the glorious radiation of the sun that is Mao Zedong. And that, of course, anticipates some of the glory that he would get posthumously. On that image, you may first think that this is maybe Lenin or something, but this is a depiction of Norman Bethune. And here Lei Feng records in his diary how he read Norman Bethune and how he feels inspired by Norman Bethune. So you think, this is still not Mao Zedong? But of course it is Mao Zedong, because there's a very famous essay that Mao Zedong wrote about Norman Bethune. And that essay has been read back and forth throughout the Maoist era. So Lei Feng proves a good soldier of Mao Zedong by reading Bethune. And of course, Bethune again gets the halo. And then we move to the last panel, which is only, like, this is panel 102 and then panel 104. That is the last panel that is after the death of Lei Feng. And in it now, Lei Feng gets his proper own halo radiation. So you really can see how this is a hagiography of Lei Feng and how these discourses are interconnected. So that maybe is from the aesthetics and also from the ideological contents, one of the core ways to depict a hero in the Maoverse. I'm now moving to Lu Xun, about which I am trying to write a book at the moment. He was many things. So he lived from 1881 to 1936. So he died before the communists really took power, which probably was to the best of his luck. He was a translator, he was an intellectual. He was very important for bringing, for example, woodcut art to China. He was also involved in debates about the uses of comic art in China in the 1920s and 30s. But of all things, he was a modernist author. He was leftist, but if there's one word that I would use, if I only have one word to characterize his writing, then this is ambivalent. All his writings are totally ambivalent. That's why they are so interesting to read even today. So you would not, if you read these texts, you think, yeah, sure, they are clearly leftist, but how can these be, if I tell you that he's the poster boy of the revolution, how can this have happened? At the end of the Yan'an talks that I mentioned earlier, these talks that set out the dogma of literary and artistic production, Mao ends this with a quotation from Lu Xun. And if on the right-hand side of my slide, there is the translation of the poem that you can find on Marxists.org of the Yan'an talk. So that goes, fierce-browed, I coolly defy 1,000 pointing fingers, head bowed like a willing ox, I serve the children. And then Mao says, so you see, you take Lu Xun as an example, and this is how you should work. You should work for the people. You should write your art such that it benefits the people. And you should, like a willing ox, work for the children. For the children, you should work for the people. And throughout the Yan'an talks, he constantly refers to Lu Xun, making him the model of all artistic work. On the left-hand side, if you want to read that, there's a different translation of the poem that is much more ambivalent, because this poem, if you read it entirely, Lu Xun kind of jokingly reflects on his role as the father of a young child. This literally has nothing to do with artistic creation, so it's quite an out of context, quotation, but it has proven very, very productive. And even Lei Feng in his diary notes that, oh, today I read Lu Xun. And then if you trace this back, you realize, oh, yeah, he read Lu Xun, but he read the reprint of the Yan'an talks in the People's Daily the day before, and you can trace back how this works. So whoever quotes Lu Xun, and this poem actually quotes Mao Zedong. And this is also why Lu Xun then could turn into what I call the poster boy of the revolution. We have another veritable campaign of studying the revolutionary spirit of Lu Xun, and you do that with your pen in your hand. You can study Lu Xun and become as revolutionary as him. And here on the left-hand poem, that is an export version of a poem. I guess there would also be a Chinese version of it. And below here, you have this poster of Lu Xun, and you have a quotation of this fierce-browed quotation again. So here, this all is intertwined. You have a depiction of an old, almost dying Lu Xun shortly before his death. And that is, I mean, this is not called, okay, dying elder author in his armchair, but it's called Never Give Up the Struggle. So the emphasis is that up to his very end, he was in for the struggle and everything. I would also like to point out maybe a slightly different aesthetics that we have on this poster. There is a strand in revolutionary art that in music and also in the visual art that is very much inspired by European Romanticism. And so this could almost be a Caspar David Friedrich image. Yeah, maybe not fully, but you see that with the clouds and this, there is some notion of that in the image. Of Lu Xun, I have, so there is tons of adaptations of his works into comic art. And there is almost tons of biographies. And these are, of course, like the Lei Feng ones, they are hagiographies. So they celebrate Lu Xun. And my sample at the moment is more than well, it's something between 30 and 40, I think. And there's at least 27 from the heyday 1972 to 1985, when then we have the downfall of lianhuanhua. So this is kind of indicative that there is so much going on for Lu Xun. And I have picked 3 examples that are from the time when Mao Zedong was still alive. Here, you probably recall that this is one of the propaganda posters that is used as a cover page for one of the lianhuanhua. drawn in 1972. So we are still quite in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And you see here, I think, a slightly different drawing style with these different shades and this sepia feeling to it. The lianhuanhua in itself is not very story driven, it's rather static. You have, so this is this one here. So throughout you have one page the text and the other page you have an image, and each is kind of one contained story. However, what you still can see here, that you still have a Lu Xun that slightly towers above the other people, and of course he is in the center of attention. So you still see how these aesthetics play here. Here, Lu Xun confronts her adversaries, and you see again a reflection of him towering and in a very decided posture, and the villainous guys in a more crouching position. They are clearly marked through their body language as being the evil guys here. And again here, you see that's, I think, the first panel of the lianhuanhua. You see a young Lu Xun marching out into the future with a kind of a visionary thing, and that I think, down to the way that the coat is drawn, is I would say a quotation of one of the very famous I think it's an oil painting of Mao Zedong that exists, which is the Mao goes to Anyuan image, where you have Mao Zedong in traditional clothes, but really towering or walking through this Caspar David Friedrich-like landscape. So there is different aesthetic realms playing into it. And this is, interestingly, a 1976 version, almost this identical texts, almost identical images, and then in the comic I showed you before, but fully redrawn. So this is the visionary young Lu Xun image. Here we see him confronting his adversaries, slightly less clear, I think. And this is one of the last panels of the exhibition of the lianhuanhua, and that is quite an interesting reflection of historical truth. It depicts Lu Xun in a woodcut exhibition, and that is one of the last, maybe the last outing he did before his death. So he was really a frail old man, but he took the time to see this exhibition and to talk to these young artists. And this is the text then refractures this as Lu Xun constantly doing all his best for the young people and pushing them to become revolutionaries. So it is really an emphasis that probably, well, that really is not really in other accounts that you have of this visit to the exhibition. And I end with a 1975 lianhuanhua of Lu Xun, in which you see a full front struggle with Zhou Yang. Zhou Yang and Lu Xun did have their clashes during their lifetime, but this is taken up in 1975 because Zhou Yang, who happens to be still alive at the time, is the target of a campaign, and at the time he is clearly seen as one of the villains. So then, by retelling this conflict that he had with Lu Xun, that is a way then not only to cash in on the heroic poster boy statue that Lu Xun has, but also to emphasize the villainous nature of Zhou Yang in the course of it. And now we have more villains for you.
Now we're changing now radically a little bit the scenery. So just maybe to reframe briefly what we just saw. We saw a lot of examples of lianhuanhua. You saw that many times similar storylines would be redrawn after a couple of years for a new version. You saw that characters are shared across those stories. And we saw that heroes or positive characters share a wide range of characteristics. Now, it has been argued, and I think it's not a very controversial statement to say that just as heroes heroify other heroes, there would be no heroes without the villains. It was a very long sentence, but essentially, who was first, Batman or Joker, or is it Lex Luthor or Superman, or is it whoever and whoever? The question, of course, is that villains and heroes are kind of two parts of the same coin, at least in what we're kind of trying to build here. Now, in caricature, because of the essential difference between caricature and comics, in the sense of that caricatures depict wrong situations, Mao Zedong doesn't appear himself very often. But what has the case is that the shared universe of tropes and ideas is still very present. And I want to show you a few examples here and talk a little bit more about this. Now, Chinese caricatures of the Mao era were a very hot medium in the sense of a medium that provokes, that evokes response, that creates feelings and is not intending to leave you without some impression. These images, as really any caricature anywhere, to be honest, were printed in newspapers, and that's how people saw them, but also in dedicated journals, as I mentioned before, and even more interestingly, they were printed out or redrawn and placed in public spaces. Now, before I turn to this, I wanted to show you one telling example, a very early one from 1951. This image, taken from an issue of the Manhua journal, titled "Chop It in Half" or "Cut It in Half" or "Cut It Off," created by the Wei, is perhaps, if you will, a kind of collection piece of all the villains that, well, not all of them, but many villains that then we're going to meet throughout the decades. We are now in 1951, so just for the context, this was a time, and this image in particular was created during one of the first, if not the very first, large-scale campaign against something, so not to promote something, but to target something, or in this case, someone, the counter-revolutionaries. And this was important because in 1949, the Chinese communists won the civil war, but it took some time for the power really to sink in and well, for the country to calm down, essentially. There were warlords, there were uprisings, there were riots, and many other adversaries. Now, as we see in this image, and I chose it because, well, you will tell me later, but I think it is quite striking in its gruesomeness, but at the same time, because it is like this, perhaps it's quite easy to understand what's going on here. We have this serpent, which has two parts. On the left part, the tail, the head, there are a couple of heads, and these heads represent those villains. So we have there, starting from the left and then clockwise, we have people opposing the ongoing campaign, so essentially anyone who didn't like it, but the one drawn with a crown could signal who was meant here. We have bandits, feudal warlords, secret agents, and spies. And each of them has attributes: a bomb, a radio, some documents, a knife. So kind of the visual shorthand here is established. And then, of course, we have this big knife inscribed with essentially political slogan saying "regulations to suppress the counter-revolutionaries," and it's cutting off the second part of the serpent, where we have two very well, clearly understandable emblems. One is, of course, the swastika, which stands for the fascists. In this case, it's Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, the National Party, which fled to Taiwan. And on the other hand, it's the American president, Harry Truman, who represents the capital, the dollars. So we have the financial and the kind of brain power behind, of course, the villains who disrupt this nascent regime. Now, how were exactly images like these consumed? In the next slide, we will see those social situations, which for me personally, I think they're the most interesting part of it, really. So, of course, caricatures and cartoons like this would appear in dedicated magazines and in daily newspapers, and this is a very important element. But they were also shown like this. So we have here a message board, perhaps on a factory or in a commune or just a neighborhood. In the top left corner, in the bottom right corner, we have an outdoor information board where sometimes newspapers would be hung out, sometimes so-called big character posters, that's about which were yet another fascinating phenomenon of the PRC. And in the two other images in the top right corner and the bottom left corner, these are, well, mass campaigns or protest movements or just gatherings of people who are motivated or convinced, or they just feel like it, to protest against those villains. And as you see, the caricatures are very lively. They are taking, they're really just almost taking part in those events, which I think is fascinating because, as the previous image also shown, they were very rich in meaning. So sometimes you would have those, people holding up those images, kind of trying to scream out almost visually so many things, which you cannot really scream out, but you can put them on a piece of caricature. So this was the 1950s. We're going to jump now to the late 1970s, so 25 years later, to kind of trace and show you how this Maoverse of villains evolved, or maybe how it kind of kept to itself. I turned to the late 1970s and I chose this caricature poster, which is one of those examples of how caricature would be used in public. So posters like this would be created and then printed on large sheets of paper and then put on the walls, as we just saw. This one in particular is titled "This Sort of Standard Bearer" in quotation marks. And it's from 1976, December 1976. It focuses on a group of fallen leaders, so a very particular kind of PRC villains, people who up to some point held very important positions within the party, Politburo or broader party apparatus, but for some reason fall out of grace. Here it's about the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four were four leaders who, throughout the Cultural Revolution, but especially the 1970s, to various extents, but nonetheless had quite an impactful position on the propaganda, especially in publishing and cultural and arts realm of the PRC. Among them, Jiang Qing, who is seen here in these 9 images most centrally. She also happened to be Mao Zedong's wife of over 30 years. Mao Zedong died in September 1976, and right after his death, just 3 weeks after, these 4 people, among 10 or so others in the party, in the army command, were arrested, deposed, and they were kind of branded as this kind of 4. This is a different topic. I'm just giving this here for context. And this image in particular comes from another collection, which is housed at the University of Freiburg, where so in Heidelberg, we have this largest collection of lianhuanhua. In Freiburg, they have a particular collection of Gang of Four caricatures. Now, manhua helped to spread messages like this, in that they showcased the presumed and also real misdeeds or crimes of the targeted people. This particular caricature, at the same time, I would argue, also creates a certain pictorial story. So we could also treat this as a comic of sorts, if you want. The images in the first row display the crimes for which Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four were later convicted. And we see her shooting an arrow soaked in poisonous ideas against the People's Liberation Army. We see Jiang Qing leading the gang in various attacks on the party. And as the narrative progresses, the caricatures, if you will, become more and more focused on the alleged crimes and shortcomings, and all ends with a big climax. So I chose here 3 images just to talk a little bit more in detail and also to show you how this would work. So in the image number 4, and this is again interesting because as you see here what's happening, as we already discussed, we have the 3 prominences. So the centrality of a chosen figure reversed. So we're not anymore now talking about the good guys, and among them, so the good people, and among them the hero is the most prominent. We're talking here about the villains, and among the villains, the chief villain is the most prominent, which is, I think, really interesting and really clever because people knew about the 3 prominences. They were used to this visual language. So kind of to twist it around is a very clever way to criticize. Jiang Qing, in particular, is depicted here as the leader of the Gang of Four, which correlates to how the party media were also at that time talking about this event, if you will. And we see her orchestrating the 3 others of the Gang of Four in a mass creation of pamphlets. And these pamphlets, if you see in the tops, they are inscribed actually with the titles, some of the titles of the model pieces, just as the one we talked in the beginning, Taking Tiger Mountain Strategy. And this is why, this is because Jiang Qing was in charge or was particularly influential over the arts. So this image kind of is, I don't even know if it's a meta image, it's a multi-layered commentary on the 1970s, where you need to be familiar with first the model pieces of the early 70s, then with their political meaning, then with who stood behind, and then with the downfall of the people. And this all happens with this one, within this one image. And that's why I think it's a particularly nice example of this Maoverse that we're talking about, that certain things kind of repeat themselves and are quoted. Now, in the next image, this is a little bit different. Here, Jiang Qing is not anymore the biggest, the largest, the most prominent. Another woman sitting on the chair is even more villainous, if you will, than her. This is Roxanne Wittke, an American sinologist and journalist who in 1972 was invited personally by Jiang Qing to come to China for a series of interviews. The idea was, or at least that's what historians believe, the idea that Jiang Qing had was to use Roxanne Wittke in a similar way as Mao Zedong used Edward Snow in the 1930s. Edward Snow was an American communist and sympathizer of the Chinese communist cause, who managed to get very close to Mao Zedong in the 1930s and publish one of the most famous, really, political biographies of the 20th century. I would just put it out like this in the room. It made Mao into an icon. And what Jiang Qing perhaps tried to do with Roxanne Wittke was something similar. We don't know, because this is all historical writing of the winners who used this event. So the party who deposed Jiang Qing, they used this event to criticize Jiang Qing as vain, as self-focused, and as using this opportunity for promoting China to promote herself. And this caricature refers to this. We see Roxanne Wittke with a radio. We see Jiang Qing with a bag full of secrets. So what this also implies, and this is the second layer, if you will, is that not only was Jiang Qing criticized for self-promoting her own agenda, but also for selling out, for being a traitor, for being a person who will deliver state secrets of the Chinese state to an American journalist. This caricature, and this is one of many, so this interview was a very popular trope in Jiang Qing and Gang of Four caricatures, is particularly interesting because if you remember, in 1971, the PRC and the Nixon administration in the United States began to open up to each other. And by the late 1970s, well, China and America were not anymore as villainous to each other as before. So to redraw this image and this event in such a way in 1976 is very interesting. In addition, Laura Pozzi and I recently published an article in which we look at the gendered elements of the visual depictions of Jiang Qing in those caricatures. And this is also something that I think can be applied to a larger group of villains, namely powerful women, who were not that popular. The group of powerful women in Chinese politics is a very small group, maybe 4 or 5 women, who all were actually spouses of powerful men who were also politicians. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them would sooner or later fall from power. And there's a shared visual language of gendered criticism. Here, just to mention it, because I do think it's very important, we see, if you remember the previous image where Jiang Qing was leading the Gang of Four, she was still depicted in a kind of suit. Here, she's wearing a dress. She's standing as if in high heels, ballerina-like. There's a lot of visual kind of disgust, almost kind of created in the way her face is shown, which again, I think could be very clearly seen through a gendered way. The third image I want to look at is the final image. And here we kind of return to the full Gang of Four, depicted as dogs, or the three men are dogs, and Jiang Qing is maybe the leader of this group, or the mother, if you will. And this is kind of the circle closes. So yes, manhua caricatures were criticizing those bad people, those villains, but they were also teaching, informing, and warning. So in this particular case, and this is also a very popular trope of caricatures of the Gang of Four, the fact that they were arrested in the post is being thematized. Here we see the masses, if you will. Of course, this is a very loaded term, the masses, but here it is really the masses, because we see stand-ins for representatives of the workers, the peasants, the army, ethnic minorities, and so on, who, with their own attributes to kind of underline the message that we know who we're talking here about, crush the Gang of Four. And of course, they crush them because the good people in the end win. And just as a final note, it is also interesting, if you look more closely, that the three most prominent figures here who crush the Gang of Four are actually women. And this is also something Laura and I talk about in our paper, to say that those gender depictions of Jiang Qing then in the end kind of turn against her. All of this is to say that villains existed just as heroes existed, and the ways villains were depicted was interesting, but also was shared in a very common way up to a certain point.
And now, trying to come full circle again, we return to a last example of a lianhuanhua. Again, adaptation of a literary text, Maple, from 1979. So both the short story and the comic are from that year. This is a story that critically examines the factional struggle that took place during the early years of the Cultural Revolution. And it depicts basically two lovebirds who end up in the different factions and both end up dead. And of course, the story investigates the moral implications of this, the guilt that people load upon each other, and that even bystanders may load upon themselves. This was rendered into I think, an extremely vivid lianhuanhua. So you have a display of a criticism session here. You have this kind of the world is falling apart feeling during the cultural struggle. This is again the recitation of the works of Mao Zedong. So this is the Maoverse, but it is the Maoverse rethought, and it is falling into pieces. But I think particularly strong in this, visually, it uses the tropes that everybody is familiar with, but the color code is so strong that it does something with the reader. So the color red is very important. It's in the name of the female protagonist. It is the red that is the color of the revolution. The red is the color of the blood that is shed. And that kind of is anticipated here in the beginning, when she still is all in this revolutionary fervor, holding the quotations by Mao Zedong. And you may recognize this person here from the previous images. This is Jiang Qing. Jiang Qing is presented at the onset as the person who, of course, is behind all these factional struggles and this havoc that is then coming later. And that is rendered particularly strong in the way that you see people rejoicing at Jiangqing, which is a realist depiction of how it would have felt for people back then in the early years of the late 1960s. However, this blue filter on top of the image creates an icy atmosphere. So while this does not play into the standard tropes that were established or would be established through the caricatures, it still adds its very own and distinct reflection of the Maoverse. So the Maoverse continues to be there in terms of contents, in terms of the aesthetics, as a transmedial or intermedial thing, but now it is in ruins. It still would play out heavily. The authors of this lianhuanhua, the artists, got severely criticized, and Maple, the comic, was taken off the market because they said, hey, you are depicting Lin Biao, the other evil guy, in much too favorable terms. So this is about the authority of how to depict things according to how sort of the standard ways. And it also shows us how sensitive people would read, and both ordinary readers and, of course, readers in media control positions would do that. And only later on, sort of, this ban would be lifted. But that was a huge debate upon the publication of this comic. To end our talk, we want to mention that aside of these very political comics and caricatures, the late 70s and early 70s see an explosion of aesthetical styles. When we look at lianhuanhua, of topics. I mean, this is a topic, of course, that could not have been brought during the Cultural Revolution. We see an influx of foreign comics, and we see, for example, the production, and I really recommend everybody to read that, of a Chinese version of the Star Wars comics. And Nick Stember has translated that. You can find it on his blog. It's a very entertaining read, and it can also, so it is the Star Wars story, but it is also the Star Wars story refractured through the eyes of Chinese comics artists. So we see all that, and then in the mid-1980s, and I mean, to say something about print runs, we have some of these comics in print runs of 1 million comics in the first print run, and then again reprinted. Having said that, print runs are very difficult to determine. So this is a huge market at the time. And then soon after, we see there is a campaign against spiritual pollution. And that basically is the end of comic production, or of the lianhuanhua production that we have seen. And then for quite some time, we don't really see any productions from China. And with this, I think we will be ending. Here's the reference to the paper that Damian mentioned just before, a very recent publication. And we are looking forward to your questions, and we thank you for your patience, for bearing with us.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. So if anyone has a question, you can put your name in the chat, or just, yeah, and mute yourself, or any way you'd like to ask it.
And you can also take the opportunity to ask Nick, who is, I mean, he knows a lot about the 1970s, 80s comics, or Maria, who is extremely knowledgeable about the manhua and crocodile production. So yeah, we would also invite everybody to ask them.
Anybody?
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure.
I don't have a way to type it in. I can't see it on my screen.
Oh, just talk then. You can.
Okay. My remark is this is very fascinating. I really appreciate this. I grew up in New York City, and I knew in the late 70s lots of Japanese kids who were very, very proud of the manga that they were able to buy at specialty Japanese bookstores and show off. And I knew a handful of Chinese kids from my elementary school and junior high school, Chinese kids from America whose parents grew up in China. And the kids sometimes read manga, but never ever spoke about the Chinese comics that they read. But I do remember a strip that I would see the books around in Chinatown. And it was like, I think there were about three main characters. It's very familiar to anyone who pays attention to comics in the 70s and 80s in New York. And they had three characters. One had kind of an egg-shaped bald head, and another one was a little guy with a hat. And
I think it's Old Master Q.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah.
And the Chinese kids would read them, but they were embarrassed by it. It wasn't something they were proud of. And I was just wondering if this is probably around the same time. And to this day, I was really interested to hear this.
Is that a Hong Kong-based comic?
Sorry?
Yeah, it was from Hong Kong, I think.
I think so. It was, some of the strips were like 6 panels, three 2-panel tiers with gags, and others seemed a little more complex. The stories, I remember I had a few, so they were fascinating.
Yeah.
So I just thought
I mean, the thing is that
that's my knowledge.
I mean, it's a very good point. And like, as a disclaimer, probably we could have maybe been more clear that we chose this theme of heroes and villains because it's something we just found attractive to us and kind of under-researched. But those comics we talked about today, maybe not Lei Feng. Lei Feng is probably also one of the most popular, but the other ones, they were not the kind of main thing, right? So lianhuanhua were popular as adaptations of classical novels. Three Kingdoms, Sun Wukong. We had a draft of this PPT where we thought to talk about the journey to the West and Sun Wukong, but we dropped it. And of course, there's Hong Kong, there's Taiwan, and there's so much underground comics, bootlegs comics, non-official comics, especially later on, that we just don't look at because it's not essentially not what we have, right? We kind of follow the sources we have, or at least that's kind of my take on it. But what you say is very interesting, and I do hope that eventually there will be maybe the next project, Lena, where we kind of expand it transnationally, because of course, what is Chinese comics, right? I mean, once you start asking this question, you end up asking what is China, and then you end up not getting a visa. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you might also think of, if somebody reads that in Chinatown in the US in the 1970s, is that a comic produced back then, or is that somebody that their parents maybe took from the mainland from the 1950s, from the first wave of popularity? So if you look at these reading practices, they're really multi-layered. Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I read the Asterix that my dad bought when he was younger. So then that really creates yet different circles of readership. Mm-hmm. And Nick, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say about the Old Master Q. I'm pretty sure Old Master Q I think it was inspired by, or it was a bootleg of Mr. Wang Xianzheng by Ye Qianyu, which was a comic that was very popular in China, in Shanghai in the 1930s, 1940s into even. But I mean, that was one of the questions I had about your project is, I'd like to know, are you guys, because I know both of you work mostly on the socialist period, but is that something you're also going to be looking at as kind of the pre-1949 period? And because I know you're not going to get into Hong Kong and everything, but.
If we had funding for 15 years and not for 5, we would definitely do that. But we now actually are I think we more are having a 70s and 80s focus from how these projects are currently evolving. And there's enough to cover there. Thank you. Maria?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay, because I don't have my earphones. Good. Thank you. That was fabulous. I was so excited to hear you talk after a long pause that I didn't hear you at any events, but yeah, lovely to see you. But also I wanted to kind of a little bit, I don't know if it's pushback or just maybe suggest a way to specify things a little bit. So there are the things like the principles of central truth, for example, the hero, good people, etc. There are those principles of Hongguangliang, and there are the socialist realism. Again, something that probably needs a lot of definition, especially in Chinese case. But so yeah, there are hypothetically rules, but at the same time, there is so much variety. And at the same time, it feels like there was actually very little experimentation trying to push the official limits away. So do we consider this experimental? From which point of view do we consider this experimental? Because I struggle with that too. So I work on the 50s cartoons, and they were extremely cooperative with the government. And so it's difficult to even argue that cartoons can be a good designation for the phenomenon, same as for the Soviet case. And so how far does experimentation take us? And also maybe so when you talk about Malverse kind of coming to pieces, it seems to be coming back, isn't it? So do we need to consider the reflections across into Xi Jinping era? Or this is probably again something for 15 years, but still, thank you.
Multiverse, that's what you're looking for. You want the multiverse. I hope not.
Should I say something maybe about the experimentation? If you look at these comics in the beginning, you see the patterns and you see, okay, there are certain stereotypes that seem to be played out again and again. And actually, that's why I found the Lu Xun case so very interesting. I would say many of I think Nick, in your dissertation, you have this quotation of, well, we just draw these, you get paid for it, you just draw and you get paid, and just make sure the guys look nice so that the mothers who read it to their children have something nice to look at. Yeah. So there is this notion of some of this is, while on the one hand there's put much care on it, it's still sort of produced sometimes a bit sloppily. That is not the case, I think, with the superheroes. You don't mess with Lei Feng. And also you don't mess with Lu Xun, this literary giant. And the interesting thing with Lu Xun is that, yes, we study the revolutionary spirit of Lu Xun and never give up struggle and all these tropes. But then if you look at his face, he's very often stern looking. But then you have these instances where you think, well, wait, we still have the sternness, but then we have the reference to a very ambivalent text in the text. Is that mere coincidence, or is that playing out with more than a cursory glance may get from this? And these Lu Xun comics are produced with extremely much care, very much expression. And so, they are not avant-garde. The ones that were produced during the Mao era, of course, they are not outright experimental. But I have the feeling that in many cases, there's more in it than maybe the artist would outright state if he or she had been asked at the time. So there is I would say, yeah.
I would just add that there were changes, right? So the 1950s are a very particular time because of the very real danger or presumed danger, but the kind of presence of the uncertainty, right? The PRC survived and kind of kept on existing and established itself. But as we know, it was not obvious, right? I mean, especially in the early 50s, it was really not obvious, Korea War and so on. So, and then with the Sino-Soviet split, right, when suddenly all the experts left. I mean, there's a lot of kind of questioning. So perhaps maybe then, especially under Stalin, right, still Stalin, there was not much maybe willingness, or space to kind of push the boundaries. But there also was, right? I mean, we have all those discussions in Manhua magazine where they kind of send letters and write editorials and figure out what is what. And the same happens later in Lianhuanhua, right? That we have this journal, this comics journal, where authors, creators, producers would send in letters and kind of battle it out in a way of what exactly is supposed to be a comic. And this is super interesting for me in the 70s and 80s, where kind of I look more at, where I do think there was quite a lot of happening. For example, in the Gang of Four caricatures, where a lot of people who never drew a cartoon in their life, suddenly kind of felt the urge, followed guidelines, and started drawing. And we have those cartoons a lot online on the database and in Freiburg, and some of them are really good, right? So this is also interesting that somehow those how-to guides or visual education or kind of familiarity with the genre over decades resulted in something like this. And some of them are very bad. Some of them are really not particularly, well working, I guess, for what they're supposed to be working. But so this is kind of one thing which I think that maybe this experimentation is not as big as it can be under a planned economy or whatever, or a control system. But maybe there was a little bit more later on. I don't know. And then in the 80s with the bootleg culture, right? Lena mentioned the Star Wars example, which it's been talked about a lot and written a lot about, but it's still, I think, kind of is valuable because in the Star Wars bootleg comic, it is clearly drawn by someone who has not seen Star Wars, the movie. So you have kind of information there which comes from the movie, maybe from the poster or something, but also you have information just plainly wrong, right? And this is interesting as well, because there's many other examples like this. We have bootleg Tom and Jerry comics, with bootleg Tintin comics, with bootleg Mickey Mouse comics, which are all kind of an interesting mix. But yes, I mean, this Maoverse thing, it's a proof of test. We're very not sure if we're going to keep this, but we didn't want to say that everything was free prominences, right? Obviously, we just wanted to say that it's interesting that certain characters like Bethune, like Mao, obviously, but also others kind of appear here and there in similar ways as, you would open an Iron Man comics and suddenly there's an issue where he is hanging out with Hulk or whatever. This is kind of interesting that maybe that's not the typical way you look at it, right? But
I really like the idea of Malverse. I think it's really cool. I like the idea because I think we've talked about this before, but the idea that the Lucian that appears in the comics is not the Lucian, and you talked about this, right? He's not the actual Lucian, right? And the same thing, I think the Mao who appears in the comics is not the actual Mao. And every comic is kind of, it's a multiverse expansion of, kind of creating new versions and new tropes about these characters. I think it's a really nice way to emphasize the fictionality.
I googled the term. If you Google it, it gets you to, of course, the poetry of Mao Zedong. So Maoverse. So that is also something, I mean, it's the comics one, but it has much more items. It's even a multiverse because it has the poems and the propaganda posters and the photos and all that.
I know, Damian, I think in the first slide you mentioned this, stylistically, the cartoons were sort of jumping off from Soviet caricature and, and a step away from Western. So was that not seen? I mean, how was that seen in terms of a revolutionary culture to be using Western, I guess, photography and Western models, and as opposed to looking back at earlier Chinese parallel projection, parallel perspective, things like that are not part of the West.
yeah, I guess Maria can answer this much better than me, but so I mean, my take will be that it was really a merger. So there was a very big cartooning kind of boom in the 1920s, 1930s, especially in Shanghai, which was this global metropolis with a lot of people, especially from the UK and France, kind of bringing in maybe these ideas with earlier Chinese versions as well. I mean, there are cartoons which I think I saw the most interesting ones, which actually mix it, right? So you're gonna have maybe ink painting or kind of commentary on traditional Chinese way of oil painting or something like this, but then kind of using those tropes. But after 1949, especially in the beginning, there was a big movement of translating Soviet books about any kind of expertise, knowledge, know-how, if you will, technology, and so on. And also, in this particular case, one of the earliest publications from 1949 even are those how-to books. So basically how to draw a cartoon, just directly translated from Russian into Chinese. And I think these became very useful in kind of establishing what a cartoon can be in this new reality where a guerrilla party essentially becomes the party in power, but there are still villains, right, and enemies and adversaries, which is a kind of maybe I don't know, the driving force, if you will, maybe for a few decades, really, or maybe even of whole Maoism, if you will, of kind of establishing socialism, but also accepting that within socialism there are still enemies, right? So how does this work? And then those cartoons kind of jump in conveniently to be approved and drawn in a way that is desired, but at the same time targeting the bourgeois, the capitalist, the kind of still existing issues. I don't know if this answers your question. Maria, do you have anything you want to add to this?
If I may, I don't know, like how fast do we want to wrap this up? But very briefly, I would first of all say that so the Chinese manhua magazine, the magazine that was founded in 1950, I kind of argue against the idea of considering it modeled on crocodile. At least between 1950 and 1952, it looked different, and it was constructed differently. It pursued a different set of targets. It was only from 1953 that it becomes visually and contents-wise similar. So I would say, yeah, it was a more complicated relation than one was based on another. And also the whole period before 1949. So first off, the Shanghai cartoonists during the 30s quoted, or they were aware of Soviet cartooning tradition just as they were aware of Katakovitz and Gross and whoever else you mentioned. But in the 40s, during Yan'an, for example, and during the Civil War, they were also trying to develop their own variety of kind of socialist cartoons. So Hua Junwu and the rest of them, what they were doing in the Northeast, in the Northeast and Manchuria, that was not Soviet, but also not Shanghai style. So there is this very complicated dynamic about who is borrowing from whom and how it shapes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit similar with animated film. So there's a really good book written about Chinese animation by Daisy Du, who kind of argues as a similar kind of approach to the question, as you just said, Ben, in the sense of animated film is a very kind of Western product or invention, and then how it became cynicized or kind of socialized in the Chinese way. So this is kind of maybe something that could be of interest to look into, right? So they were asking the creators of Chinese animation throughout this period, also in Manchuria and also after 1949, were struggling with this a lot as well, right? How to use kind of a medium which has very established ways of talking, especially dominant, of course, by Disney, Caricature brothers, all these kind of people from this time, to convey very different messages, right? Just an idea I had.
Yeah. There's also that famous case of the story about why China started making really Chinese style animation. Supposedly, I think it's apocryphal, but there was a claim that there was a Chinese animated film called Why the Crow is Black. And the film won a big award, I think in I think in Eastern Europe or maybe even Venice, something like that. But people thought it was a Soviet film, supposedly. And so then after this, the story goes that Toei, the kind of the leader in charge of the Chinese animation industry, he then said, okay, now we need to make actual Chinese looking animation so people will know that we're not making Soviet animation. I don't know, but I've heard that it's not actually true. I think Maria, you tracked that down and found out that it was
in
a
the
made up
book,
story.
she has actually a chapter. Yeah, there's a whole chapter, and there's this book about this where she basically traces it down and says it's completely not possible to be true because this film, the first kind of purely Chinese animated film, which then later has been claimed as such, came out too fast to even be possible to have been started being produced in response to the Venice event, right? Because I mean, it takes a year and a half to even make an animated movie, and then Venice was in August, and the film came out in December. And basically, she's like, it's just the timelines don't align. But then she also says that it maybe doesn't really matter, that it kind of was important that there was this kind of foundational event. And then even more interestingly, she shows that the Chinese animation was then extremely popular on Western film festivals, art house, Cannes or Prague or whatever, whereas like the more kind of traditional, if you will, Western inspired animation was the one which was popular actually in China, right? So it's kind of a very interesting kind of dichotomy there. And yeah, I think on cartoons and animation, there's a lot of, or comics, or Chinese comics and animation, there's a lot of similarities in this field. So.
Yeah. Okay. If there are no other questions, I have lots of other questions, but I don't want to. I think if they're not anybody else, I think we can. Maybe I'll try to pursue my questions online somewhere, because I know it's a field I don't know too much about, but it's very interesting. Style and revolution and where these things come together, image styles.
I would love
So,
to hear your questions, Ben. If
no,
you have one or two.
no, it's
Definitely.
open that up now because it's but anyway, thank you. No, these books were all over the stationery stores in Chinatown when I was a kid. So somehow they were getting around the world, maybe. I don't know exactly which ones. And how did these collections come to Heidelberg? And do you know, were they one
Yeah.
person's
So
collection?
the Heidelberg collection is a donation. There is a person, Andreas Seifert, who wrote a very all-encompassing book on Chinese comics in German. That was his dissertation in Tübingen. He left academia, and even though he did his PhD in Tübingen, he donated the collection to our university because our university is very good at handling collections that maybe are not standard fare. So that's the bulk of the collection, and then we buy that stuff also on Chinese online secondhand book venues. So it's sort of and because many of them were really mass produced, so a lot of the stuff you find endless copies. Some it's more difficult to trace down. And Germany even has another about 3,000 copies collection, which is the Berlin State Library, and they are still in the process of cataloging it. But so there is another big collection out there.
Okay, it's good to know how these things happen. Okay, thank you. That was fascinating, and we'll follow your work. When you move on to your next project, we can have you back. Thanks.
Thank you for
Thank
you for having us.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
a lot.
Thanks everyone for
And
coming.
thanks for coming, everyone.